And I'm going to let everybody in right now.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's program. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know of our upcoming events, which we hope you will join us for. On February 23rd at 7 p.m., we have a program, Riding in Solidarity, Jewish Americans, African Americans, and the Fight Against Bus Segregation with Mary Elizabeth Murphy. And on March 3rd, we have a special Women's History Month and Art History program with local artist Gail Kaplan Rosenblum. And as always, our programs are supported by the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. If you wish to register for any of our upcoming programs, please visit jhsmichigan.org/calendar. This evening, we are very fortunate to be joined by Charles R. Gallagher, and he is an associate professor of history at Boston College and the 2017 William J. Lowenberg Memorial Fellow on America at the Holocaust Museum, and the Jews at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, which is a part of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He is going to be discussing his latest book with us, The Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten History of the Christian Front. And without further wait, please welcome Charles R. Gallagher.
Thank you, everyone. It's a real honor to be here at the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan. I'd like to thank Kara Schuchman for her readiness to accept my proposal to talk about these people who followed the priest from Detroit named Father Charles Coughlin so closely and so disturbingly. So thank you, Kara, for all your help in setting this up, your readiness to accept my proposal, and also for putting together the technical aspects of tonight's talk. I'm very grateful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that I can bring up my PowerPoint presentation, which I have put together for tonight's talk, where I'm focusing on Michigan and Detroit in this story, which sounds kind of strange because the title of the book indicates that everything is happening in Boston. Copley Square is a very famous square in Boston, Massachusetts, and I just wanted to make clear that this book does not get written without a Michigander at the center of it, Father Charles Coughlin of Detroit, and published in late September of 2021 by Harvard University Press. This is the overview for tonight. Is where I'm planning to head. Is I want to talk about the beginnings of Father Coughlin's movement really in Detroit, and then move on to talk about New York and his support for this group called the Christian Front there in New York City. Then after 1940, its movement up the coast to Boston. And again, Father Coughlin is always in the background here, giving ideological support to what I consider to be his movement. And then finally, throughout World War II, what this book really shows us is that even as Coughlin's influence diminished in the public sphere, there was a great deal of influence of the Christian Front, the movement that he took over in the late 30s. There was a great deal of geopolitical viability to the group as World War II worked itself to its conclusion. So that's where I plan to go. I'm just going to fly through some slides here, tell the story as best we know it, and then encourage questions after we're done. This is where I want to start. I want to start in Detroit. This is a letter from Father Coughlin's FBI file that really knocked my socks off when I read it, because he's calling this Major General Smedley Butler here in his uniform. He's calling him from Detroit one night, and this is really a memorandum of a conversation about that phone call that General Smedley Butler had with Father Cochlin one evening at his home, which was a mansion on the main line of Philadelphia. I'll encourage you just to read that red box. And this is what Coughlin is proposing in 1935. And Butler was so disturbed by it that after talking with friends, and it nagged him for almost a year, he contacted the FBI and related his conversation with Father Cochlin from the year earlier. And so this is really where I start the book. The first chapter of the book starts with this episode of Coughlin trying to cajole Butler into leading an armed force of Christian men south to Mexico to what Butler said was to overthrow the government of Mexico, because the Calles government, who Coughlin considered to be communistic, that government never considered itself to be socialist, but not communistic. But to Coughlin, that didn't matter. They had arrested the Archbishop of Mexico City and thrown him in jail. And the reason I start the book out with this really disturbing episode is I want to show that as early as 1935, this priest from Detroit was thinking about trying to put an armed force together, which was motivated by religion to redress Catholic grievances through armed force. So that's where the book starts. Then it goes into a lot of the religious aspects of it, because this is kind of where I'm coming from in the book. I'm trying to argue that in the past, when people have looked at this case, and the reason no one has written a monograph about this case, this movement, is because when political historians look at this group, they search for pure politics and party politics, and you won't find it there. You won't find that there. And when religious historians look at it, all they see is just abstract craziness and militarism that at the time was downplayed as just being fantastical. And so that kind of religious perception has stuck for the last 80 years. But when I looked at it, I thought that the religious impulses were true and authentic, and that they were having an impact on moving believers into a forward paramilitaristic position. And the underground impulse that was really defining the movement was anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics. And that's really the motivator. It's the question that the book tries to get at the heart of. It's a question that the book tries to understand. And really what I found in the book was that this process of Catholic anti-Semitism led some Catholics to undertake arms and to engage in espionage for Nazi Germany. And I'd like you to know too that most of what is written in the book is brand new in terms of the history. The history that's being presented in the book, I would say 75% of it, especially the intelligence part, has never seen the light of day before. No one had access to the FBI files before, and nor the British intelligence files on this. And And when you put the pieces of the puzzle together, it's just really fascinating. And for the last 80 years, people have been trying to shove this case under the rug, and I was just glad I was determined enough to try to figure it out. This is Arnold Lunn, this gentleman here with the glasses. He's the guy who came up with the idea of a Christian front because he was a Methodist from England who converted to Roman Catholicism in 1933. And he wanted to kind of heal the rifts of the Protestant Reformation by using anti-communism as a method by which to draw Christians and Catholics, Protestant Christians and Roman Catholics together in the face of what he saw as a threat of global political Catholicism. When Father Cochlin gets that idea, he reads about Lunn's idea, and he takes up Lunn's idea and changes it. In my view, he mangles it and decides that Lunn is not correct. He's incorrect about the idea of bringing Catholics together against communism, because in the view of Father Cochlin, communists are not discrete political communists. He believes that communism is a secular religion that is attractive in a secularly theological way to Jews who are non-practicing. And he sees global communism as the result of Karl Marx's theories and Marx's Judaism, and also Vladimir Ulyanov's or Lenin's Judaism, which was not thoroughly known at the time, but Coughlin argued that Lenin had Jewish lineage. So Coughlin combined communism symmetrically with Judaism. And so whenever when Coughlin claimed to be an anti-communist, that was code for anti-Semitism, as we know. Father Cochlin, many of your listeners, many of the viewers will know, was a very famous radio priest from Detroit who had a program on Sunday afternoons out of WJR in Detroit. And by 1938, he has 30 million listeners in America that is 132 million people. So about 1/5 of the entire country is listening to him on Sunday afternoons. And to put that in perspective, these days, the largest number of viewers of a network television show is about 12 million. I think America's Got Talent, if anyone used to watch that, that was the highest rated TV in modern times, with about 12 million viewers a week. So these are slides that are kind of very granular in their origin, but they're to explain a little bit about why Father Cochlin is feeling the way he is. He sees what's going on in Mexico as being motivated by communist governments, read that, Jewish communist governments, and he sees a real persecution taking place in Mexico. The Cristero War in the late 1920s really affected a northward migration of mostly Roman Catholics northward, and there was a great deal of political criminality adjudicated against Catholics. Here in the lower corner, we have, with his arms spread, Miguel Agustin Pro, a Jesuit priest who was shot by firing squad on trumped up charges in 1927. And then, of course, the Spanish Civil War and the Republican government there, which Father Cochlin is equating as communist and consequently as Bolshevik, Judeo-Bolshevist. And he sees both of these global phenomena as creating real Catholic grievance claims. I don't want to get too deep into the woods here, but there are these religious impulses that are forcefully working their way through Father Coughlin's believing and listening public. There are authentic Catholic theologies that dominated the day. One of them was Catholic Action, which was a kind of an uplift, social uplift movement, which increasingly became anti-communist throughout the 1930s. And then the real one that I think was most important was a thing called mystical body of Christ theology, which was being put forward by the popes in the 1920s and 1930s, which was based in the theology of St. Paul about the head and the body being the part to the whole, the head to the body, that Jesus Christ kind of spread mystically throughout the world, brings the baptized people of Christ together as one body. Now, this has, in my view, this has huge transnational political implications, because if Catholics are being shot by firing squad in Barcelona or Madrid, then that has impact in Boston or Detroit or in Grosse Pointe or throughout Michigan. And so this is what Coughlin is feeding his people. And the theology is right there to push them into this final circle of creating a desire for a kind of counterforce to the communist paramilitaries, in order to, which these governments, the communist governments, were calling themselves Popular Front governments, that Coughlin wanted to use this Lun idea of a Christian front to take up arms against the communists. And so there is Father Coughlin's shrine of the little flower in Royal Oak, kind of the tower of power there. And in the basement, in the crypt of that building that you're looking at, is an altar, where a large altar dedicated to Miguel Agustin Pro, the martyr of the Mexican revolutions in 1929. So this box, which I've placed up here in the top now, is really kind of what I think about when I think about the Christian front, that they're combining the theology of the day with the tumultuous politics, and that's pushing them to feel defensive about the expansion of global communism, which they deem exterminationist. It's not without some merit. In the Spanish Civil War, for example, 10% of the diocesan clergy of the Archdiocese of Madrid was executed by firing squad, for example, simply for being believers. And so, in fact, they're commemorated today in the liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church, where a mass is celebrated for the 6,500 members of the clergy, that's nuns, seminarians, religious, and priests who were deemed to have been credibly killed by communist forces during the Spanish Civil War. So that's where Coughlin's coming from. And because of his tie-in between Judaism and communism, it creates a very difficult situation, a very heinous and evil situation. So what does Coughlin do when he, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book was, frankly, I said to myself, we don't need another biography of Coughlin. We don't need more investigation of Coughlin. I think we need to look at the people under him. And so this book is about his foot soldiers. And his first foot soldier that he commissions is a guy named John Cassidy in New York. And you can read what he did in July of 1939 on the screen. But Cassidy is an anti-communist of the First Order. He's a devout Catholic. He is a graduate of St. John's Law School in New York, who took 3 times and he still couldn't pass the bar. So he's kind of a restless soul who is looking for some sort of larger idea or organization to latch onto. And this Christian Front idea of Father Coughlin's is the perfect organization for him. Once he gets going, he's the primary recruiter, organizer, public voice, and inspiration. And he himself is fully on board with paramilitarizing the Christian Front. And let me be clear here. The Christian Front altogether has about 100,000 members on the East Coast at its peak. There are only about 25 members of the Christian Front that have paramilitarized, that have decided that they are going to create a secret cell that will take up arms in order to put down the communist revolution against a Christian America, which they see as imminent. So there's not everyone who is a public member of the Christian Front even knows that these paramilitary cells exist and that they have this fantastic plot in place and these ideas about a communist revolution in the offing. So the first real vocal leader here is Cassidy in New York. And as you can see from the slide, in July of 1939, Father Cochlin, via speakerphone from Detroit, gives a blessing to Cassidy at a meeting of the Christian Front in Philadelphia at the Metropolitan Opera House, where he kind of like anoints Cassidy. So this is also what Coughlin does with his foot soldiers. He makes a quasi-religious ceremony out of proclaiming their leadership, and then they know precisely what to do in terms of getting weapons together in this first stage, particularly getting weapons together. And as 1939 turns into 1940, the Christian Front begins to arm themselves through a rule in the U.S. Army Code that was written in 1903, which allowed members of the National Rifle Association to purchase military-grade weaponry, ammunition, and essentially bomb-making material, because you could get cordite through this mechanism as well. If you were a member of the NRA, you could buy military rifles from the War Department through an office called the Office of Civilian Marksmanship, and have those guns shipped to the local armory. And then for an extra $1.35, the Army would ship these rifles, which these are Springfield 1903 rifles. It's an amazing gun. Shoots a 30-06 shell, which is about a 3-inch long cartridge, full metal jacket. Shoots about 60 rounds a minute. It's about a 5 clip in that chamber of that weapon, and it's each one of those bullets will go through a brick wall. In fact, it's a much more. My nephew is a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and he says it's a much more powerful bullet than the NATO rounds that the U.S. Army carries today, and I believe him. And so they're fully armed and getting more and more dangerous and theologized. There's one FBI report that talks about them going to their target practices in Narrowsburg, New York, and also they had a target range in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. They would wake up early in the morning, do target practice, and on Sundays they would break an hour and go to church, then come back, and they would read the Talmud actually at their firing range, because they felt they needed to know what the enemy was about, and then they would go back to shooting targets and at the firing range. They are arrested by the FBI in January of 1940 because the FBI was able to get an informant into the group, and they're put on trial in January of 1940. This is coast to coast news. So in the middle of this slide, this is mass being said at the Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak. And if you haven't been there, it's actually just as interest in kind of Art Deco architectural style, it's worth visiting. It's entirely in the round. And at this time, these Christian Front members who are being backed by Father Cochlin, and Coughlin first attaches his name to them publicly, even after their arrest. And then about 3 to 4 weeks later, he backs off and says that he has nothing to do with the Christian Front. I think that's because he understood that the government and the FBI really meant business in terms of prosecuting them, because they charged them with sedition. the violent overthrow of the US government, something that we've been hearing about in the news these days. The problem was that the couple of things, they charged them with sedition, but it's very difficult to charge men who are caching weapons in Brooklyn with trying to overthrow the US government at the Capitol. So they never got that charge completely adjudicated or argued properly. And then the FBI and the government knew nothing about that code of the US Army, where you could legally buy weapons and bomb making materials if you were a member of the National Rifle Association. So they basically won, they got acquitted. And then here we see them cheering in Brooklyn, cleared of charges. And Father Cochlin here in this this graphic by Herb Block, a cartoonist, he feels exhilarated by the acquittal and is very happy. And there's, interestingly, I put the image of the Capitol in the background, which is with us so much these days. When I was writing this book, the January 6th had not happened, but as I've been thinking about it since, it's just very chilling. So what happens is that in New York, Father Cochlin and the Christian Front end up getting taken off the table. The FBI raid and the prosecution, even though they're acquitted, they no longer have any public above board function. They've basically been shut down. So the movement moves upward to Boston, up the coast, and they're met by a man who is introduced in the book for the first time. It's the first time that anyone's really kind of dug into his background. He's a Nazi that no one's ever heard of, but he's a very important guy named Herbert Scholz. And in the book, you can read about his lineage. He's assigned to be the consul, the diplomatic consul in Boston, but in fact, he is an agent of Heinrich Himmler, and he's an officer in the SS, in Himmler's SS. He's a personal friend of Himmler, and he is sent to Boston to do espionage work. And these are the people in his neighborhood. Ernst Röhm, who founded the Brown Shirts with Hitler, was one of his first closest friends. Himmler was also a very close friend. And then he got his first job working in the Nazi Party headquarters in Munich as the aide-de-camp to Rudolf Hess, who, while he was working for him, became the deputy Führer. So Scholz is sent over to the United States to be a heavy, actually, to kind of spy on German diplomats who Hitler thinks are not kind of up to speed with their ideological Nazism, and then also to turn the screws on other Americans and to start spy operations in the United States. That's basically why nothing's been written on him, is because he was such an energetic spy master. You can read all about his spying in up and down the East Coast. He ran about 10 or 12 different spy operations very successfully. And one of the other things the book tries to do is that the way historians have written about Nazi espionage in the USA prior to this is that the Nazis had kind of a bumbling and stumbling operation, both in the lead up to World War II and during. And what I show is that Scholz's operations were very professionally done, successful, secret, and unknown, especially his operation with the Christian Front, unknown until this book was published in September. I'm just showing this because what most people don't know is that Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor of Germany was a guy named Heinrich Brüning. He was living in Boston, and he was becoming more publicly anti-Hitler. He was teaching in the political science department at Harvard, and that's why Scholz was sent to Boston. And you can read about the intimidation campaign that he ran against Brüning, which is absolutely chilling and entirely disturbing in the book. So when he comes to Boston, the FBI is trying to track German nationals as being the prime targets for Scholz's recruitment. But in fact, the person who's most excited to work with Scholz is a Irish Catholic working class seminary dropout named Francis P. Moran, who since 1936 has been working closely with Father Coughlin's political organizers in Boston. And Moran becomes the most energetic organizer in Boston of the public-facing Christian Front, about 30,000 members now in New England. He is a very savvy organizer. He's an excellent public speaker. He's a charismatic figure. He's well educated in Catholic theology, so he knows all of those. In the book, you'll read about how he kind of melds together both of those religious impulses to push the Catholics who listen to him to kind of do his bidding. And by the summer of 1940, he falls into the arms of Scholz. And again, none of the members of his group know this, but he begins to meet secretly with Herbert Scholz. And because of his seminary education, he was educated by the Franciscans in New York, and they had been pushed out of Germany under Bismarck's Kulturkampf. And the seminary where he went was largely German Franciscans who taught him fluent German. So when he came back, he left the seminary, in my view, due to the celibacy requirement, because he gets married within a couple of years of coming back to Boston. And so he comes back as this educated, thoroughly kind of Germanophile, and Scholz offers to pay for his headquarters to be run out of a suite in the Copley Square Hotel in downtown Boston, which is right near Trinity Church. It's one of the most loveliest places in Boston, and a very high rent district. It's and so for a working class Irish Catholic to have a headquarters in Copley Square is also, Scholz knew exactly what he was doing because he was playing into his ego. Catholics were not hanging around Copley Square in 1940. So again, Moran is meeting secretly with Scholz, and the people who listen to him and go to his meetings. He gets thousands of people to listen to him speak twice a week in Boston. None of those people know that he's meeting secretly with Scholz. I'm putting this slide up here because it's a letter from Father Coughlin to, it's a photostatic copy from Father Coughlin to Moran. And in my view, this whole letter is a joke. It's a fake that Coughlin backdated this letter after the New York insurrectionists were arrested. My view is that he immediately sent this letter off to Francis Moran in Boston, because the letter kind of exonerates the Boston Christian Front from any sort of terrorist activity. And it's Father Coughlin encouraging Moran as the leader of his group to be very deferential to the government and to not do anything that would be politically mischievous. And in my view, it's just a fake. And this is a letter that after the insurrectionists were arrested, about 3 weeks after, Moran distributed this letter to the press in Boston. And even though it's signed by Coughlin, and that's a true signature, I think it's a fake letter. At least that's what I imply in the book. Of course, the big question is, does Father Coughlin know that Francis Moran is secretly meeting with a Nazi SS intelligence officer? That much I haven't been able to establish whether Coughlin knows that. But what I do know, because of interrogation reports after the war, is that after the summer of 1940, Scholz, shown here again, and Moran are meeting secretly. They're up to no good in a number of different ways. And in the book, you can read about all of the spy operations that Scholes is pushing Moran, and Moran is accepting them to do. And I basically think that Francis Moran was the single most important and effective in a deleterious way Nazi agent in the United States, and no one has known about this until the book was published in September. I mean, the stuff that he and Scholes were able to do in an espionage way, in a pro-Hitler way in America, has never been known before. And if you read the book, as I was writing it, there were just moments when my jaw would just drop because I couldn't believe what a tandem these two were in terms of their pro-Hitler work. There's Scholes again. He's seen here in the consulate on Chestnut Street. And then I'll move through here. This is actually the consulate 2 blocks from Beacon Hill. It's on Beacon Hill, 2 blocks from the State House in Boston. And in fact, actually, that's a very chilling image, I think. It was actually so disturbing. We thought about it as a cover photograph, but we thought it was a little bit too disturbing to put on as a cover. And I kind of agree. I think it would be a little bit too shocking. And that's about 2 blocks from John Kerry's house, as a matter of fact. So these are just some schematics, some graphics about what's going on. In this red block here, what I'm trying to show is that 4 national intelligence agencies were surveilling the Christian Front, plus the radical squad of the Boston Police Department. And none of these security agencies had any idea that Scholes and Moran were a tandem. I mean, it's in the book, you can read about what they were doing. They were actually affecting, I argue in the book, they were affecting battlefield decisions during World War II. I really wanted to push that because for many years, the political scientists have pushed religion into the soft power category, which means that, well, religion is not really connected to, it's not really as primary as military or economic concerns. It's kind of a cultural ancillary to anything that goes on during wartime. But you can read about what I put in the book in terms of their trying to influence military activity of the U.S. Army and infiltration of the U.S. Army. It's pretty incredible what they were able to do. Scholes was running about 12 other spy rings that were quite effective, in addition to all that he was doing with Moran. They were infiltrating army camps. They were infiltrating research centers in terms of military research, R&D. It is unbelievable what they were doing. So this, as we kind of head towards the conclusion here, the hits just keep on coming. There's a Jesuit priest who, after the acquittal of the Christian Front in New York, gives this speech on a radio network in New England where he gives moral permission for the Catholics of New England to join the Christian Front again, because they've been acquitted and now Catholics can join the Christian Front, because while the Christian Front is anti-Semitic, at least they're anti-communist. And so membership in the Christian Front in New England starts to tick up after June of 1940, after the acquittal. So William Stevenson, who runs British intelligence in New York, he gets wind of the uptick in membership of the Christian Front in Boston. And because the FBI is out to lunch and all the other intelligence services in the US are out to lunch, the British come in, they decide to set up their own front organization to take out Moran and the Christian Front. It's basically how it works. They send a cutout, which is an American who's actually a traitor. He's working for the British. And I know, it's like the British are our noble ally, but they're not supposed to be doing illegal intelligence ops on American soil. So this American cutout, I have a hunch who it is. I have a hunch it's one of two people, but I can't say because I don't want to get sued. So the cutout comes in and they recruit this young woman from Boston who's a news reporter, a very civil rights minded, named Frances Sweeney. And she's a devout Catholic. And part of her Catholicism is this kind of forward thinking notion then, but which we know today as part of the doctrine, is that she believed that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics was a sin, was a moral depravity. And so she agrees to work against Moran and the Christian Front in Boston. And she says, yes, I'll accept the head position in this Irish American Defense Association. And she runs the organization having no idea that it's really a British intelligence operation. These are some of the secret documents I was able to find in London. I mean, it's really jaw-dropping when these are recently declassified too. They were declassified in 2017. It's really jaw-dropping when you go over and you get the secret files released, and there's this character that you know about. You've been reading her letters in Boston, and you go to London, look at the secret files, and there are her letters signed by her. So we can talk about that in the Q&A. The British intelligence operation was an amazingly successful operation, because what they did was they obviated the entire FBI and all the other security agencies, and they pushed Frances Sweeney to give a kick in the pants to the local police commissioner and basically have the Boston police take down Moran, which they did. They detained him in January of 1942 when he was passing out books at one of the Christian Front meetings, books published by a publishing house in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, that was run by a recently indicted German espionage agent. And so the local police moved in at the pestering of Frances Sweeney and her organization, and took down Moran. The problem was that Moran was detained and not arrested because the publishing house had only been indicted. It hadn't been, the publisher hadn't been convicted. So none of that literature was actually contraband. And so Moran was protected by the First Amendment. But what happens in the spring and summer and fall of 1943 is that Moran is pushed underground. The Christian Front is dissolved above ground, but Moran goes into creating a cell structure in Boston. And the cell structure, in my view, kind of atomizes the anti-Semitism in Boston, and about an 8-month period of Catholic on Jewish violence erupts in many different parts of Boston, as far west as Newton and Brookline, but also on Blue Hill and in Mattapan and in Dorchester, where there's Catholics and Jews living side by side. There are gang riots, and you can read about this in the book. The U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps files on this were really quite illuminating. The U.S. Army was even kind of monitoring this situation. And in my view, it was Moran. Moran was in contact with Scholz, who was over in Germany. I'm implying that I know Moran had a shortwave radio. Scholz goes on to be the aide-de-camp to Karl Wolff, the highest ranking Waffen-SS general, and sent to Italy. This is something from 1943. The FBI finally, towards 1943, gets a woman to infiltrate the cell structure, and she records Moran's thoughts. And in one case here, this is from Moran's FBI file. By 1943, after this rioting situation is underway, we get kind of the real anti-Semitized Moran, the exterminationist Moran, and you can read that chilling outline. Now, and informant T1 is a very brave individual. We still don't know who she is. All I know is she's a woman. She worked at the Charlestown Naval Yard. She knew fluent French and German, and she also worked at the Catholic Information Center in downtown Boston. So she would have been considered a devout enough Catholic to be in Moran's company. And they spoke German to one another when they met in their cell structure between 1943 and 1945. Moran, by that time, was trying to recruit returning American veterans who had firearms ability in order to create extermination groups against Jews that he felt would be used after the war was over to exterminate Jews in America. It's really, really very chilling. But rather than ending on that disturbing note, I want to end as I usually do these talks with a snippet of a letter from the fiance of Francis Sweeney. Now, unfortunately, Francis Sweeney dies in 1944 at the age of 37. She had congenital heart issues, and she died suddenly walking down the street one day. And her fiance wrote this line that I always like to read, and it says, "It just doesn't seem right that one who could see so much evil around her and spared neither time nor courage to fight it should suddenly be taken away. To us who are left behind, her deeds should be a challenge to carry on the good work she started." And so on that note, I will relinquish my share screen and go back to Cara, and perhaps we can take some questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat feature, the Zoom chat feature, and I am happy to moderate that conversation. We did have one come through. Is it possible that you could send me the title and author of the book about spying so that I can pass them on to the group?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Well, about what kind of spying, because the only Scholz's spying has never been written about before, but there are some really good books, kind of general books on Nazi spying in America.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you. A question came through. What led you to explore this topic?
Well, so what led me to explore it was when I was an undergraduate at Marquette University, when I was about 18 or 19, I had to do a term paper for my undergraduate history class. And I knew I wanted to do something on Catholics, and the class was about national security. So I started just looking through old newspapers. I was interested in the World War II era, and I did kind of searching around about Catholics in World War II, and up popped one of those photos from the newspaper where it showed those Christian Front members with their rifles. And I thought, gosh, you don't see that every day. And then I saw that they were charged with sedition, which was overthrowing the US government. And in my classes, I was always being taught that Catholics during World War II were becoming more and more patriotic. Not that they wanted to overthrow the government, they wanted to support the government. So I went to my teacher and I asked him if I could do a paper on that topic. And because the historical profession had been so kind of grounded in this perception that this case never amounted to anything. And it never amounted to anything in their view because the Christian Front never detonated any bombs and they never actually went forward with an insurrection. They were, the FBI raided their headquarters before they could get to that stage. So my teacher said, don't even bother doing that. And so my graduate work ended up being in American Catholic history. And my first book was on a World War II topic. And when I was doing research all those years, this group kept popping up and I kept seeing them with their rifles and their bomb making materials. And I just said, something I really have to dig into this further. So after I got done with my first book, I just started digging around, and I finally was able to unearth their FBI file, and it was just kind of jaw-dropping. And then all these other pieces came together with the Nazi spying and the British spying. There also the Russians come in later on. I couldn't get to that part, but there was actually a Russian military intelligence operation focused on South Boston.
We did have a few questions come in. First,
Sure.
was Father Cochlin ever called to task for his complicity with American Nazis?
So again, nobody knows about this. Now, Donald Warren, who wrote a biography of Father Cochlin in 1996, he was able to pinpoint a pretty high level of funding that Father Cochlin received. But again, his bishops wouldn't have known anything about that because German intelligence was really excellent at covering their tracks. In my view, they were really very good spies. And so the money that Coughlin was getting from the German consulate in Detroit actually never got found out until 1996. And then all of this activity between Coughlin's foot soldiers in New York and Boston really hasn't been unearthed until really 2021 with this book.
A two-part question from one of our attendees. The first is, was Father Cochlin involved with the front after he was shut down in early 1942?
So the only viable branch of the front after 1942 was the Boston front. It's a problem to say how engaged Coughlin was. And there are two reasons for that. Coughlin was very astute at covering his own tracks, and he commissioned his foot soldiers, Moran and Cassidy, and gave them his kind of religious benediction. And then he receded from the scene. And in my view, his whole plan was to have these true believers carry out on the ground in the region his program for either terrorism or espionage. The other piece in this puzzle is that the FBI is particularly inept at their spying. I mean, in my narrative, I've said this before, FBI stands for fabulous but incompetent. The Scholes and Moran ran circles around the special agent in charge in Boston, who had come up the ranks in the FBI on the Dillinger case. He really knew how to catch bank robbers and car thieves, but he knew nothing about counterintelligence. And they ran circles around him. I mean, they kept it secret until 2021, all that they were doing.
Was it mostly Irish Americans in the front? And if so, why?
So in New York, there were some Italian Catholics involved. Their leader was a guy named Floyd Caridi, who was actually very as aggressive as Cassidy in his attitude towards paramilitarism. So there were some Italians in New York and in Philadelphia, mostly Irish in Boston. And that's because of the high levels of Irish immigration in the 19th and 20th century to Boston. And I think Coughlin's own kind of outreach to his own ethnic style and persuasion. Even though he's a Canadian, he's Canadian Irish, and so there was much sympathy there, and also the fact that the Irish were anti-British was quite a clue for Scholes to move in and recruit Moran. So Moran was kind of a trifecta for Scholes. Moran was an anti-communist, he was an anti-Semite, and he was also anti-British.
Did Henry Ford have any relationship with the Christian Front?
Yeah, so I can't find any direct connection between Ford and the Christian Front. And this question comes up frequently, and just to reframe it, many people have questions. Was the IRA connected to this group? Was Henry Ford, was Charles Lindbergh connected with this group? And after writing the book, what I can say is the reason I think the Christian Front is independent of all those other kind of pro-Hitler anti-Semites is that Father Cochlin is a megalomaniac, and this is his show, and this is his turf, and it's his Catholic, paramilitarized, and public movement. And he is not going to accede any power to any other public individual, be they Henry Ford or Charles Lindbergh. My view, Coughlin has his eyes on the presidency into the 1940s. And again, this is all fantastic and to us seems crazy, but this is how having studied Father Cochlin, it's thoroughly within view.
Pre-Vatican II, how did the Catholic Church hierarchy view Judaism?
So this is really the main complexity of the book. Anti-Semitism was baked into Roman Catholicism prior to 1965. And the theological grounding of that was what Catholics have referred to as the deicide, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, according to the biblical understanding of the time, or the biblical interpretation of the time, through the mechanism of the Jews. And so Moran and his followers are not going to accept that it was the Roman Empire that was the proximate cause for Jesus to be put on the cross. The Christian Front is arguing it had nothing to do with the Roman Empire. It was the Jews who actually propelled Christ onto the cross, and they are to blame for the death of Christ. And that is, if you read the book, in their meetings, they explain all that from the stage.
Did Coughlin ever acknowledge or apologize for his anti-Semitism?
That's a good question. Coughlin was taken off the radio due to a threat by the then Attorney General in 1942, due to the threat of prosecuting Coughlin's newspaper under the Espionage Act of 1917. And because Coughlin's elderly mother was on the masthead as a part owner of that newspaper, Coughlin had to shut down because he didn't want to put his elderly mother under cross-examination by the Attorney General. After that, he goes into seclusion, and he's banned from public speaking about politics by his bishop. I shouldn't say he's banned. He's encouraged not to speak about politics. Presumably, there's a stick in the back waiting for him. He'll probably be banished to some parish that far away from Detroit. So he keeps quiet for the next until 1972, until his death. Periodically, he gives interviews to various newspaper reporters, but that's only at about 10-year intervals. About every 10 years, he gives a newspaper report. He never apologizes.
What, if anything, did the Catholic Church do about what Father Cochlin was preaching?
I think it sounds like the energy of that question is connected to a sense of repair. Like, has the church tried to repair? I think these days, the American church views this in the kind of larger scope of Catholic-Jewish relations. And so the Catholic-Jewish relations ambit is kind of siloed into it's kind of the domain of theologians. And so the theologians rarely look at the work of historians on this topic. because the theologians are kind of forward thinking about this. And it's not, frankly, it's not very seemly. It's quite disturbing to actually to take a look back and to think about all of this that was going on. And so I think for Catholic-Jewish relations, particularly in the US, there's this impulse to keep looking forward and to kind of start with the good days of Vatican II, where Catholicism reforms itself to understand the Jewish people as neighborly and brotherly rather than enemy. But it's the historians who kind of do the work in bringing to light the exactitude of what it meant prior to Vatican II. And I guess I guess it's just too siloed to have the institutional church talking about the history as much. Now, the papacy takes the Holocaust very seriously and has in the past and still does. And so I think that's kind of where Catholics are. Pope Francis is being extremely open with Jewish Catholic relations. And so I think that's where it is at the moment. I think my stuff, the stuff that I do, is just a little bit too, it's a little bit too unseemly to kind of want to go back and kind of wander around in. But I think it's fascinating, and I view it as kind of a moral imperative of my own as a part of repair, because I don't think, as Pope Francis says, Catholics shouldn't be afraid of their history. And so that's basically what I'm doing, is writing about Catholic history.
Are there any Christian Front type organizations operating today under Catholic theology?
Well, fortunately, as far as I can see, there are, I don't want to name people or movements because I monitor that fringe. But just to let you know that there are some fringe elements that I see as having threads of what was going on here in the 1940s, and they're kind of articulating that in modern times. So I can say that I'm keeping my eye on those areas, and I intend to keep doing that.
Well, that is all the questions that I see in the chat. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight. This was extremely interesting and extremely informative. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that we are all very excited to read the book if we haven't yet. Yay. And we hope everybody enjoyed this evening's program, and we hope to see you very soon on one of our upcoming programs. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Cara. Bye.